Okay.
Although you should check in TBS's account to make sure that they have space, because
Ooh.
it only gives you a limited amount of space.
Then just do it to the computer.
Well, the reason I like doing it to the cloud is that I guess it doesn't really matter. You can do it to the computer.
All right. If I
What I do is I'll then load it up onto YouTube and then I can share it.
pause, stop. It's now recording according to my icons. It is recording right now.
Yeah, I see that also.
All right, then hit stop.
Good evening, everyone. I've put you all on mute for a moment. I see the numbers are still increasing on our participant list, but I don't want to make this run too long over our allotted time. So please let me introduce to you my favorite tour guide and lecturer. John, most of you know, is a graduate of Kelman Academy, as well as Akiba Barak Academy. He attended Columbia University. He actually graduated and then made Aliyah and was in Israel for about 8 years or so. He earned there a master's degree at Bar Ilan University in archaeology and the history of Israel, or some such title, and also earned a license to be an Israel tour guide. He is a licensed tour guide in New York City as well. And I will now turn the microphone virtually over to John and let him tell you about a stroll through biblical ages in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Jonathan.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Dan. Always a pleasure to be back at TBS, either in person or virtually. So thank you so much for having me. Tonight, we are going to go through a bit of a biblical timeline through the artifacts of the Met. One of the nice things about being able to do it virtually is that I can mix and match a few things. So I've included some artifacts that are relevant to the time period, but not necessarily at the Met. And wherever we have artifacts like that, I will point it out. So it'll be clear what is actually in the Met and what is outside the Met, but in the context of our subject. But I do love the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It contains 5,000 years of human civilization's achievements, going back to the dawn of civilization, and the newest piece in the Met is always less than 1 week old. As Lila Atchison Wallace of Reader's Digest fame in 1970 gave a gift that the floral arrangements in the main hall should be changed in perpetuity. So every time you are there, you are guaranteed to have something new to see at the Met. Another distinct thing about the Met is that it is the rare museum that became a museum before it had a collection. We think of the great museums of the world, the Vatican Museum, the Louvre, the British Museum. These all had these massive collections that were added to for hundreds of years before they were offered on view to the public. So the Metropolitan Museum of Art is quite unique in that it has the size and scale of these other great museums, however, a different history. And so I'm going to share my screen and we'll get into a little bit of the history of the Met, and then we'll walk through the halls virtually and relive some moments in biblical times. So I am going to share my screen. All right, let's get into present mode. And just a word about questions. So I'll run through my spiel, and as we're going through, if questions come up, you can feel free to type them into the chat room. I'm not dexterous enough to manage the chat room and present virtually at the same time. So at the end, we'll go to the chat room, or we will also be able to unmute ourselves to ask questions at the end of the presentation. So first, a little history of the Met, and I'm a tour guide, so I get into the nerdy stuff with the big picture history. 1624 is when the Dutch will first establish a colony in Manhattan, and they call it New Amsterdam. And the Dutch will be in Manhattan for 40 years. 1664, the British already have colonies to the south in Virginia, to the north in New England, and they think that New York would look a whole lot better as part of the British Empire. So they send in their navy, point their cannons, and say, you can keep your businesses, but you have to submit to English rule. And the people of New Amsterdam here, we can keep our businesses. We don't really care who's in charge. So without a shot being fired, they submit to the English, and the King of England will give it to his brother, the Duke of York, and rename New Amsterdam New York. Jump ahead 100 years, 1776, America declares independence. New York City is a city under 30,000 individuals. And it's the third largest city in what's to become the United States after Boston and Philadelphia. 1789, it will become the first capital. And now we jump ahead to the Civil War. In the 1860s, New York City is already a city of over 1 million people. Explosive, explosive growth. And if you are in the midst of the first modern war, where are you going to build your great factories? In New York City. So throughout the Civil War, New York's industry develops remarkably fast. And after the American Civil War, New York City is in the midst of this transition from a small colonial village that it once was to the great modern metropolis it is becoming. And so just after the American Civil War, as sort of a symbol of that transition, a group of wealthy Americans who were in Paris, and they were just blown away at all of the wonderful urban planning, the wonderful artifacts of the Louvre, they sit down and they decide that we need to create a national institution and gallery of art, and we'll put it in the greatest city, New York City. But they didn't have a collection. So they had to start small, getting things here and there. Benefactors would give artifacts or pieces of art, sometimes as donations, sometimes in wills. But it was a relatively small collection in the beginning. And it was only in 1888 that the Met opens up in the current location where it is now. And it looked nothing like it does today. I'll show a picture momentarily. Just wanted to jump ahead since this is a Jewish crowd. In 1933, the Met will have its first Jewish president in George Blumenthal, who made his fortune being the head of the American operations of the Lazare Frères Bank that was born in the middle of the 19th century in New Orleans. We'll talk a little bit more about him briefly. But now I'm going to move this over. So our original structure looked very much like the other structures of Central Park. It would have blended in really well with structures like the carousel. If you've been to Central Park in the last few years, you'll see the dairy has been turned into sort of a visitor center, and there's a games library in Central Park. And they all have this lovely brick architecture. And the original structure of the building would have fit into those other buildings quite nicely. And actually, we're seeing it after an addition was already added. The original would have been from this arch These smaller arches to this arch would have been the entirety of the museum, and you would not have entered from Fifth Avenue. You would have taken a carriage ride through Central Park and up onto this driveway right over here, and you could have entered from the side, from within the park. The Met, however, from its origins, was growing incredibly rapidly. And so by the first decade of the 20th century, Richard Morris Hunt will build the entrance that we know of today. He just builds it right in front of the original structure. And Richard Morris Hunt was the first major New York City architect who was educated in Paris. After him, he was so popular that basically at the beginning of the 20th century, anyone building anything in New York City had to be educated in Paris because they wanted New York City to look like Paris. He also has the distinction of creating one of the most iconic structures in the world. The pedestal to the Statue of Liberty was his work. Today, the Metropolitan has about 27 acres. It is absolutely massive, one of the largest museums on earth. And the original, if you follow my cursor, the original structure is this roof right in there. So the Met is kind of this ever expanding collection, New York City's constant project. And here's just a short clip of the Met's architecture through history. So how does the Met get its collection? It was slow going for the first couple of decades until a locomotive industrialist in Paterson, New Jersey, who a little bit of his obituary is on the left-hand side here. His name was Jacob Rogers. He was not particularly big fan of art, but he was known as a fairly terrible human being. And it seems like instead he wanted like the dramatic effect of his nieces and nephews reading his will and discovering that none of his fortune would be left to them. And he leaves it all to the Met. He also leaves a specific clause that said the principal could never be touched, only the interest that accrued. So they are still buying things with the Rogers Fund. And if you go through the Egyptian galleries, basically any gallery in the Met, you'll see tons of things that were purchased by the Rogers Fund. And he sort of set the precedent of how wealthy individuals would start to contribute to the Met. And then J.P. Morgan, who we see in the center shortly after Jacob Rogers dies, he is going to start giving a large part of his art collection to the Met. And he will set the precedent that basically anybody who wants their name to be known in New York City had to be a part of giving to the Met. The prestige alone was absolutely massive. And on the right-hand side, this is a piece in the Met today in the American galleries given by Jacob Schiff, who was the Jewish J.P. Morgan. He was J.P. Morgan's great frenemy. They were sometimes allies, often rivals in banking in the beginning of the 20th century. And Jacob Schiff's daughter, Frida, who we see here, is going to grow up to marry Felix Warburg, and they are the ones who are going to build a mansion on 92nd and Fifth Avenue that would later be given to JTS, that today is the Jewish Museum. So that is Frida Warburg right over there, who gave that. And a little bit about the Jewish a little more of the Jewish history of the Met, we have George Blumenthal. He was a German Jew banker who takes over a French Jewish bank's operations in the United States, and he builds himself a mansion on 50 East 70th Street that no longer stands today. But in the inner courtyard, he wanted to have something massive, and to get a sense of American purchasing power at the beginning of the 20th century, kind of like out of Downton Abbey, all these aristocrats in Europe, they had all this land and all of these beautiful castles, but they didn't have money. So they would sell parts of their castles to wealthy Americans. And George Blumenthal buys an entire courtyard from a castle in Spain that was 500 years old or 400 years old at the time. And if you recognize this room in the Met, it leads right over to the Watson Library, named after the former CEO of IBM. But all of the columns, the portico, were all originally from this Spanish castle that George Blumenthal purchased, installed in his mansion, and then left to the Met when he passed away. So now let's go back in time and start our journey to ancient Egypt. Over here we have the tomb of Perneb, which goes back nearly 4,500 years. This is what greets you when you go into the Egyptian galleries. The Met has the largest Egyptian collection outside of Egypt because they had to deal with the Egyptian government at the beginning of the 20th century, that if they led the excavations and funded them, that they would split the artifacts between Egypt and the Met. It was a good deal for the Met, and for several decades this was the case. However, eventually Egypt realized that they were parting ways with just remarkable fortune, priceless artifacts, and today, if it's excavated in Egypt, it remains there. But this goes back almost 4,500 years to nearly the dawn of civilization, to the time before Abraham. And this was a tomb of one of the courtiers of Pharaoh, going way back then. And it's from a necropolis that sits right outside an area called Saqqara. And so we can see the pharaonic pyramid, which has survived. It's so massive, it has survived the test of time, but around it, the necropolis around it had been covered by the sands of time. So there are more and more excavations taking place, and with Perneb, they took the excavations apart, they brought it to the Met, and all of this paint that we see inside the offering chamber is all original, preserved because Egypt is so dry. So from 4,500 years ago, we can see the friezes are carved out and the paint is all original. We can see the figure of Perneb and all of these servants and slaves bringing offerings. You can see this individual bringing a goat. We're bringing a whole variety of foodstuffs and hay to sustain the being of Perneb after death. And so right after, and we go to Genesis, and right after the story of Lech Lecha, we have Abraham in that same chapter, that Lech Lecha, where God tells Abraham to pick up your things and everything that you have known and leave your home to go to the land that I will show you. And Abraham follows God's word, goes to the land of Canaan, but there is a famine. And so he goes down to Egypt. And Sarah is the delight of Pharaoh's court. And so Pharaoh brings Sarah into the court, and he summons Abraham. So Abraham would have been surrounded by all of these extraordinary hieroglyphics like we have seen in the tomb of Pernod. And shortly thereafter, Abraham is going to leave from Egypt, and he goes back to Canaan, and he's going to have the covenant with God, where we have the origin of the Brit Milah. Already at that time, we have circumcision. This is the first known use or depiction of human circumcision in the world, was in Egypt around this time in the area where the tomb of Pernod was found. And so here we have what the original, and for our benefit, a bit of the thing, and we can see a little bit about this pivotal rite that is going to become so defining in Judaism, being practiced in Egypt. Here we have it a bit different than what we know from the Bible. These are adults who are having it done as sort of like a rite of passage, which is fairly common. Circumcision is a practice that is practiced with civilizations and cultures throughout the world with different meanings assigned to it. The question is that could Abraham have been influenced in his time in the court of Egypt by Egyptian practices? Now, that doesn't change the meaning of the practice, just whether or not it would have been influential in the practice that we've come to know today in Judaism. And jumping down to the tomb of Meketer. So 4,000 years ago, a pharaoh named Meketer was entombed outside of Thebes in caves along a valley. So if you look at the arrow, you can see some of these human-made caves. And in 1920, Met excavators had gone, and they saw that the tombs had already been robbed. They were already empty. And they were just doing a survey and trying to figure out whatever they could learn from these empty tombs. And one of the workers saw that there was a little bit of a crack in the wall, and so they opened up the floor, and under the floor they find these wonderful artifacts that we're going to look at shortly, sort of thrown together under a false floor so that any potential grave robber would not get to them. And some of the images very much recollect the story of Joseph and later on the enslaved Hebrews. So Joseph was in captivity in Egypt. He was sold off by his brothers, and he's brought to Egypt. While in prison, he hears of Pharaoh's dream. Pharaoh has a dream that there are 7 fat cows, and then there are 7 skinny cows, and the skinny cows eat the fat cows. And Joseph understands this as there's going to be 7 years of plenty, 7 years of famine, and Egypt better prepare. And so because he interprets the dream correctly, Pharaoh will release him and allow him to prepare for the coming famine and make sure that Egypt has plenty. And so these are the models that were found in this cave. We have a granary and individuals who are preparing grain, and then we have scribes who are enlarged over here, who might play that Joseph role, that are taking down all of the specifics, making sure that Egypt has enough to last whatever is going to come its way. They found a whole diorama of a bakery, and in the bakery, here are some close-ups. We have the kneading of dough, preparing of flour, and some of the most fun, we have a little brewery down here. We have the rowing of our boat, and all of this is purely original, that has been preserved for 4,000 years, all the paint and everything, including a slaughterhouse. And shortly after Joseph, there's going to rise a Pharaoh who does not know Joseph and enslave the Hebrew slaves. And these artifacts very much bring to life what the Hebrew slavery might have looked like, at least a little picture of it. And then one of my favorite things in Egypt is this papyrus basket on the left was found in a tomb that was excavated from right around the time of 1500 BCE. And it always makes me think of the story of when Moses was born, and we have the slaughter of the innocents, that Pharaoh fears that the Hebrew nation is growing too strong and orders that all the baby boys should be killed. And so Yocheved, Moses' mother, hides him for 3 months, but when she could no longer hide him, she got him a papyrus basket just like this, coated it with tar and pitch. Then she placed the child in the basket and set it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. And the basket is going to float over to the royal palace where Pharaoh's daughter will discover it. And now we don't know that this was used on the Nile or it was used to contain babies, but we do know this is a papyrus basket from the time period of Moses. So in Hebrew, the word that they use for a basket, specifically this basket that saved Moses, was called a teva. And so just a brief trivia question. There's only one other vessel in the Torah that is also called a teva. And that vessel is Noah's Ark. So it's these vessels of salvation that have their own unique Hebrew word. So now we're going to leave Egypt, our last thing, and none of these are in the Met. These, talking about archaeology, these are the 4 ancient inscriptions that mention the word Israel from the biblical period. The first one on the left is in the Egypt Museum in Cairo. This is the Merneptah stela, and this dates to 205 BCE. And at the bottom where my cursor is, here it says that Israel is no more, its seed has been laid waste. And that's the first mention, ironically, of the name Israel outside of the Bible. Merneptah was the son of Ramses II, and after our next slide is going to be a timeline. So I'll get more into the timeline in a moment. The Kirk monolith was found on the border of modern-day Syria and Iraq, and this is in the British Museum. And it dates to 852 BCE and talks about a confederation had risen up against the Assyrians that where the Israelite king Ahab played a foundational role in that confederation. Now, King Ahab is also the great nemesis of Elijah. This one is the most famous. The Dan Stela was found in the 1990s on the northern border between Israel and Lebanon in the ancient city of Dan. And where it's been highlighted in white, that's also for our benefit, it's reference to a defeated king of Judah, Ben David, the descendant of David. And our last one, also from the same time period, 841 BCE. This was found in Jordan, a Moabite king, making reference to the battle that Ahab lost to the Assyrians, and then the kingdom of Israel contracts territorially, and so the Moabites are sort of asserting their independence. Now, a little bit of the timeline, of our biblical timeline. Dating the Exodus from Egypt is incredibly difficult. We have no archaeological evidence of the Exodus. A lot of scholars give right around 1200 BCE, which would put it at 3200 years ago. And that comes from both trying to date backwards from King Solomon, whose dates we have pretty well, and also estimating that if the Hebrew slaves are building 2 cities, one called Pithom, one called Ramses, that it was probably after the most powerful Ramses II, who reigns during the 13th century. In the Book of Kings, it says specifically that Solomon starts building the temple 480 years after the Exodus. So if we go by that dating, we're looking closer to the 1440 BCE. So we don't know exactly. But in our biblical chronology, we have the judges will rule the country from about 1200 to 1000 BCE, and then 1000 BCE, we have the united monarchy. We're talking Saul and David and Solomon, who is going to build the first temple. And in the Bible, it says that after Solomon dies, the Pharaoh Shishak is going to go destroy the country, but not occupy it, and goes back. And that is the same thinking that in Indiana Jones and Raiders of the Lost Ark, they argued that that same Pharaoh took the Ark in that campaign and brought it back to Egypt. So that's why Indiana Jones takes place in Egypt. Although the Ark just gets lost to history, never mentioned again. From this point, after the United Monarchy, the great empire will be the Assyrians. And up until 721 BCE, where they destroy the northern kingdom of Israel, 10 tribes of Israel are dispersed. And then the Babylonians will rise in 586 BCE. Their empire will be short-lived when the Persians will rise up in 536 and rule until Alexander the Great comes and brings Hellenism in 332. So the Assyrian Empire. This is the throne room from the palace of Nimrod in modern-day Iraq. And the Assyrian Empire was also the time period of Jonah and his mission. So Jonah, we're going to read the story of Jonah very soon on Yom Kippur because it is the greatest story of atonement. Jonah is the only Hebrew prophet who is told to go and prophesy to non-Israelites to leave the country and go to Assyria, to the greatest empire of the time, and tell the people in the largest city in the world at that moment that if they don't amend their evil ways, God will smite them down. The God of Israel will smite them down. It's a daunting task. And in this context, it's kind of understanding why Jonah would have been hesitant. And in the throne room, we have these 12-foot tall sphinxes that are flanked by these images. And this is a guy who grew up in a world where there were no graven images. So just imagine how intimidating this would have been to go and try to tell the greatest empire in the world at the time that they needed to change everything about how they were acting, or they would be smitten. So Jonah flees to the sea, can't escape from God, so God sends a storm, there's turmoil out at sea, and Jonah recognizes that he has to meet his fate. He offers to be thrown overboard, swallowed by the great fish, and then he atones for 3 days. His atonement is accepted. He goes, he carries out his mission. People of Assyria never know whether or not he was telling the truth because they repented. But we do have this theme of repentance, just a perfect story for Yom Kippur. In 721 BCE, the Assyrians come from modern-day Iraq and modern-day Syria, and they destroy the northern kingdom of Israel. The 10 tribes to Israel are lost to history. And then the Assyrian ruler will continue into the kingdom of Judah and destroys all of the major cities of Judah. He gets to besieging Jerusalem, but fails to conquer Jerusalem. The second greatest city of Judah at the time was a city called Lachish. And these friezes were found in the throne room in Nineveh. So after the story of Jonah, Jonah goes to Nineveh the artifacts from the Met were in the throne room in Nimrod. The capital had moved to Nineveh, and the friezes that depict the conquering of the second greatest city of Judah are today in the British Museum. And we can see that they have, from the same time period, the same artistic style. And I'm going to play this short video to see a little bit. Oh, wait 1 sec, let me go back. Of what is depicted. So now we get a recreation of the larger royal palace in what at that time in the 8th century BCE was the greatest city in the world. So we can get a bit of a sense of how it would have been utilized originally. And now, oh, I wanted to pause it. Well, so we can see that there are these diagonals. These diagonals are depicting the siege ramp that the Assyrian soldiers built, which has been found today at the ancient city of Lachish. And they went up to the hill to get to the city walls and ultimately conquered. And then the rest of the frieze is showing the prisoners of the kingdom of Judah who are taken back to Assyria as slaves. But they failed to conquer Jerusalem. How did they fail to conquer it? The Bible tells us that King Hezekiah was the king in Jerusalem at the time, and he built a wall, which we have found in Jerusalem. This is a massive wall that was discovered after the Six-Day War in Jerusalem. In 1948, the fighting in Jerusalem had left the Jewish quarter mostly in ruins. So in 1967, when Israel reconquers the old city of Jerusalem, before building up, and these buildings here, these residential buildings, were built in order to look like they are ancient and consistent with the ancient architecture, but they're brand new. And they also excavated down, and we found a wall that dates to 2,700 years ago. And the Bible tells us at that moment, Hezekiah built a wall. And here we found a water tunnel, which was the other thing that Hezekiah built according to the Bible to withstand the siege. So we find the two main things in the Bible that are associated with Hezekiah and the survival of Jerusalem. They live to fight another day, and they will survive for another 120 years, but ultimately it will be the Babylonians who come and destroy them. And the last bit is this is a structure in Nineveh that was used up until the last few years called Nebi Yunus. It was a mosque dedicated to the prophet Jonah, because in Islam, all of the Hebrew prophets are also considered sacred, and they're also prophets. And ISIS destroyed this structure just in the last few years. But the Assyrian Empire will be short-lived. After failing to conquer Jerusalem, is only a few decades before the Babylonians will destroy the Assyrians and become the major power players in the ancient Near East. And these are two lions in the Met that were brought from the ruins of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. And this is a depiction of the Hanging Gardens. And you can see these are the size of those lions. So it would have been an absolutely massive, terrifying edifice. It would have been utterly overwhelming. And in our Jewish calendar, we'll move back a little bit because this is most associated with the holiday of Tisha B'Av, the destruction of the Solomon's temple in Jerusalem in 586 BCE was done by the Babylonians and Nebuchadnezzar. And the first great exile of the Jewish people is under the Babylonians. So most Iraqi Jews, Persian Jews, can trace their roots back to this moment in history 2,500 years ago. And our next transition is we have a cylinder would often be how edicts were written in ancient Near East. This cylinder is in the Met, and this is Babylonian. But the more important one for our purposes is the Edict of Cyrus. In 536 BCE, the Persian Empire will rise, and Cyrus will issue an edict that's mentioned in the Bible, allowing the Jews to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple that the Babylonians had destroyed. And here, this is in the British Museum, and this is an edict of Cyrus that is allowing all peoples to return to their ancestral homelands and to rebuild their sanctuaries. So it fits in perfectly with our biblical story. And the Persians will last until Alexander the Great. And Alexander the Great brings Greek culture. And I wanted to manage time, so I skipped over Greek artifacts. I wanted to go directly to one of the vessels of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So there's only a handful of these vessels. These are ceramic jugs that really are not worth very much. They're a dime a dozen from the ancient world. However, because they contain the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are such a monumental find, one of the great finds of the 20th century, it all starts in December of 1947. 1 week after the United Nations had voted to partition Palestine into a Jewish and an Arab state, the first of the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in the Judean desert by a Bedouin shepherd. And inside jugs like this, he finds ancient manuscripts, sells it to a antiquities dealer in Bethlehem, and a professor Sutnik will find them. A professor from Hebrew University will find them, and he buys them up, and he starts to analyze them, and he sees that they are indeed 2,000 years old, and he starts to read what he can of them, and he finds the oldest pieces of full texts of books from the Tanakh, from the Hebrew Bible, still in existence. And especially for modern day Israel, a country that feels the need to prove its right to exist over and over again. This is hard archaeological proof of active Jewish life 2,000 years ago in the land of Israel, as well as proof of the continuity of Scripture as we know it. So how did this get to the Met? It was a gift from the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan. So this gets us very, very confused, because that area fell into the West Bank, which was Jordanian from 1949 until 1967. So the first Dead Sea Scrolls that were found ended up on local antiquities markets and were bought up. And then throughout the 1950s, more and more would be found, and they would be on the international antiquities market because Israel had more interest in them than anybody else. So Israel was paying big money to bring as many as possible, but it was Jordanian territory. So Jordan also has Dead Sea Scrolls and vessels. And ultimately, this makes its way to the Met by way of the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan. And so this is one of, I think, the most interesting and pieces. Now we're going into Roman Judea. In 63 BCE, the Romans will defeat what is left of the Hellenistic Empire, and there will be a Jewish vassal kingdom under Roman Empire. And Jewish religious practices at the time consisted of letting bodies decompose for 8 or 9 months, and then going back and collecting the bones and putting them into structures like this, ossuaries. This structure is about maybe 1.5 feet long and maybe 1.5 feet tall, something like that. Like it is pretty small. You can't fit a person in here. And one of the best um, sources that we have on this time period is the New Testament. Right, the New Testament, Jesus was a Jewish boy from the Galilee. So it's very instructive on the story of Jesus' burial, that Jesus was brought into the cave of Joseph of Arimathea because he was from Nazareth, so he didn't have a local family tomb. And one of his followers donates a tomb for Jesus. And Jesus was intended to have the body decompose for 8 or 9 months, and then ultimately the remains would be put in a structure like this, an ossuary. And on Easter Sunday, they went and checked on the body. In some of the Gospels, they talk about that they were going to continue to anoint or oil the body and perfume it. And they discover that he has risen, which gives rise to Christianity. This was quite common in Jewish burial 2,000 years ago, that the body would be put into a cave or some place where it could decompose, and then you would revisit the body, collect it, put it into a vessel like this, and put it into a niche. And for those of you who have been to Jerusalem in the last maybe 20 years or so, you may have been to a spot that's right behind the Begin Museum. This is older. This goes back to the Assyrian time period. So 2,700 years ago, this was a wealthy family tomb where these round semicircles is where you would place the heads of individuals who had recently been deceased. And then later on, the bones would be collected and they were put in an ossuary off to the side. This is in Jerusalem, right across a valley from the old city. The most interesting thing about it is that on the right-hand side, these are artifacts from the Israel Museum. These contain the oldest quotes from the Torah that have yet been found. And what is it? This is the priestly benediction, or the prayer that the priest would say over the community. May you be like Ephraim and Manasseh. May the Lord shine his countenance down upon you. And that is the oldest quote, the oldest verses that we have surviving outside of the Torah. Excellent. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And yeah, if anybody has any comments or questions, we can open it up.
All right, if you would please wave your hands either visually, or if you'd like, use the chat box or the participant box rather, to raise your hand electronically, and hopefully we'll see them, and then Jonathan can take your questions. So feel free to do that. If I see any hands going up, I'll be happy to recognize you. And a lot of people here are not, I see Harold and Judy Einhorn. Let me see if I can unmute you. And
He's
very good.
helping
Harold
you.
and Judy.
Jonathan, I just want to thank you. That was absolutely fantastic. It just made the whole Bible real. It's just, I cannot thank you enough. Thank you.
He gave a whole thing.
Wonderful. I'm glad that you felt that way.
There he is.
Yeah, I feel that way every time I'm walking through the
That's
halls of the Met. It's just like, it feels like it's coming alive.
Got red.
I really love to do, like around holidays, I love to do before Passover to bring groups through the Egyptian galleries and like to be in that moment. And I'm so glad.
Thank you.
Jonathan, we have a question in the chat box.
Oh, yeah.
How big were the figures in the scenes, like the slaughterhouse and the bakery?
Ah, so that it would have been around the size. I guess the container is around the size of a large shoebox. I'm thinking like when I buy hiking shoes, and it's an extended shoebox, and so the figurines were
Darren.
smaller than like a Barbie doll.
Very good. Does anyone else have a question that I might pass on? I don't see any waving hands. I see Roy Levinson. Let me get over to him. Roy,
Hi.
go ahead.
Good evening. So, is there any archaeologic evidence anywhere in the world that would speak to the stories in the 5 books of Moses?
Spell it out.
You have to mute Sylvia.
John, did you get that? John, are you with me?
I can do that again if you want, Charlie.
Oh, hold on. I think we lost our speaker. No, there he is.
Okay,
John.
yeah. Sorry, I got muted. Yeah, I did hear the question. It's a great question, and I would. So there is some outside consistencies in some of the stories, and what I mean by that is that there are Babylonian flood stories and things like that. However, outside reference to any individual or to any specific events, not really. So the first mention of Israel is 1200 BCE, but it would be a stretch to argue that that is a reference to the Exodus, just because all it says is Israel was destroyed, and that's it. And I do think that in comparing the stories that are consistent, for instance, every civilization in the ancient Near East has a creation story, and most of them are incredibly violent. Like the Babylonian creation story is Marduk rises up against his mother, who was like the ruler of this Titan-like class, and he cuts off her head, and her head is the globe, the crevices of her face, the mountains, her tears are the waterways and the oceans, and out of her blood was created humans so that they could become the slaves of the gods. And so the beauty and the peace of the version in the Torah, I think, speaks a tremendous amount to. But no, I don't think that there's anything in particular from the 5 books of Moses that can be confirmed, with the exception of the civilizations that are mentioned.
Any other questions?
I see a question. Hildred has a question.
Yes. Hildred, please go ahead and unmute yourself if you can.
I thought I did.
Yes, you did.
Oh, yeah.
We hear you.
The artifacts that you showed from Lachish,
Mm-hmm.
do you know what museum they are in now? Because I'm curious, all the signs are in Dutch.
Oh, yeah. So, the video was not, but it's actually in the British Museum. And the Israel Museum has a copy of them because it's so critical to biblical archaeology. It's one of the most important confirmations of an early biblical event. And that's what, yeah. And so it's really in the 9th century when we start having confirmation of biblical events as depicted. And yeah, I'm not sure why that video had the Dutch.
Thanks.
Sure, sure. Oh, just one thing that maybe I'll wrap with is with biblical archaeology, there's a lot of stuff that's it's big business, the black market for archaeology. And so sometimes there are big question marks about what may have been faked and what's not. And there was an ossuary that was found. It ended up on the black market. It was found in Jerusalem, and it said, James, the son of Joseph, the brother of Jesus. So a couple things with this. One, we never have inscriptions or even ancient Jewish literature that says brother of so-and-so. It's always someone, son of so-and-so, a child of so-and-so. So that was a little bit odd, but maybe there was an exception because we do have a James in both the New Testament and also Josephus, a Jewish Roman historian who's writing in the 1st century CE, who talks about James, a brother of Jesus, who takes over the leadership of the Christian community in Jerusalem after Jesus' crucifixion. So maybe it's an exception because his following was so enthusiastic, they included it. And it was on display for a time in the Israel Museum. However, ultimately, they tested some of the dirt that was in the crevices of the inscription, and they found that the dirt from different parts were inconsistent, and they ultimately concluded that the brother of Jesus was added. That it was probably a coincidence, a random guy. And James in Hebrew is Yaakov, but James, it gets translated into Greek, and then it gets translated into Latin. And, so it's Yaakov ben Yosef, Achshel Yehoshua. And they ultimately decided it's probably the brother of Jesus was added. And so it's no longer on display, and it's a big question mark. But it is one of the big issues with whenever there's a really exciting find. Like, could people have been messing with it? We don't know.
John, Margie tossed you a very difficult question.
Mm-hmm.
What is the most exciting discovery of these artifacts from your perspective?
Oh, that's a fun question. I think so. My favorite ones, actually moving a little bit further to modern times in history, are the synagogue mosaic floors. That's around 1500 years ago during the Byzantine period. Before the 20th century, the understanding was the Jewish community in the land of Israel had pretty much left, and it was not significant. And we understood this because the temple was destroyed. We knew about the exile, and there were all of these restrictive laws when the Roman Empire converted to Christianity against Jews building new synagogues, filling certain roles in society and things like that. But modern archaeology, we have found all of these beautiful mosaic synagogues from 1500 years ago that show that the Jewish community was not only flourishing in the land of Israel at the time, but was remarkably creative and creating wonderful art. And a lot of the art was using pagan imagery. The zodiac was a really common motif. So if you've been to Tzipori or Sepphoris, or in Tiberias, there are these beautiful mosaic floors with pagan imagery right in the center of them, and that would have been how synagogues looked 1500 years ago. And it raises a lot of questions about how Judaism was evolving, and particularly it seemed as though basically Jews were no longer concerned that graven images would be mistaken for other gods, and they could appreciate them for art, and using the zodiac to have this metaphorical meaning of the heavens. And thus it earned a place in the synagogue because it was representing the divine realm, even if it was pagan. So I think it just raises a lot of questions, and it really stimulates a lot of possibilities and a lot of area for exploration.
Mark Milstein would like to know where the fragments of parchment showing the priestly blessings, I think you showed with the ossuary,
Yeah.
where is that located?
That's located in Jerusalem. So it's in the Israel Museum. It's very, very hard to read. The script is very faded, and also they're using ancient Phoenician scripts. So Hebrew has never had an alphabet of its own. Ancient Hebrew from before the Persian conquest was all written in a Phoenician script. And then later on, Aramaic becomes the dominant language of the region. And we use in Hebrew today the Aramaic alphabet. So Hebrew has never had its own alphabet.
I'll throw out one little factoid that I've learned recently. The fragments of parchment from the Qumran parchments have been put together mostly by computer and human eye, and aren't necessarily correct in the way they put these fragments together. Lately, because the parchment is actually animal skin, DNA testing has been used to see which of these fragments actually have DNA that match each other. And if they don't, clearly the fragment doesn't belong with the place it was relegated to. So it's interesting that sometimes when it was thought that the meaning of the text had changed because they rearranged the fragments, they can now correct that.
Yeah, or at least know where they made mistakes.
They don't have the fragments.
Do we have other questions for John? I don't see any hands waving. I don't see any feet waving. So I will thank John very much for his presentation tonight.
An absolute pleasure.
Mm-hmm.
I will thank you all for attending. Please come back again in September when we'll have Zalman Neufeld. On September 10th, we'll talk about leaving the Orthodox community. That should be very fascinating too. So thank you all, and thank you again, John. And I hope to see you all again soon in person.
Yeah. Now get out.
Slaughterhouse Bakery, thanks for sharing. What is the most impacts from your perspective? I think John left us.
I think he did.
Well, he's not going to answer the questions then. How you doing, Charlie?
I'm fine. I'm fine. Thank you.
It was good.
Thank everybody for coming.
It
Appreciate
was wonderful. Prevented me from doing more.
Enjoyed it.
Thank you for sharing your son with us. It was absolutely wonderful.
Our
Really
pleasure.
enjoyed it. I really enjoyed it.
Our pleasure. Good. 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 Glad to hear it.